The rain pounded the deserted road as a driver slowed down to avoid a deep pothole. Amid the silence, broken only by the sound of raindrops, a muffled cry echoed, almost lost in the storm. Something inside him twisted, an instinct he couldn't ignore. Stepping out of the car and peering into the hole, his heart pounded. Down below, drenched and shivering, a little girl stared up at him with frightened eyes. But before I tell you this story, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. The fog hung heavy over Manhattan's empty streets, transforming the city's usual cacophony into an eerie silence. Behind the wheel of his Bentley, Thalion Morgan gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, trying to outrun memories that refused to fade. The leather seat beside him remained empty, just as it had for the past 8 months, ever since that Sunday afternoon when everything he loved was ripped away. The digital display on his dashboard showed 3:47 a.m., but time had lost all meaning. Sleep eluded him most nights, leaving him to wander the city's deserted streets like a ghost. His penthouse apartment, once filled with the sounds of his son's laughter and his wife Rebecca's warm presence, now felt like a mausoleum. Each room held echoes of happiness that only amplified his solitude. The bridge ahead emerged from the fog like a spectral gateway. Thalion had crossed it countless times before, but tonight something felt different. The mist swirled around the steel cables, creating phantoms that danced in his headlights. His thoughts drifted to darker places. How easy it would be to just turn the wheel slightly, to end the constant ache that had become his existence. A sound cut through his reverie, so faint he almost missed it. He eased off the accelerator, straining to hear through the quiet hum of the engine. There it was again, a whimper, barely audible above the gentle lapping of the river below. Thalion's hands moved before his mind could process what he was doing. He pulled the car to the side of the bridge, leaving the headlights on. The fog curled around his expensive wool coat as he stepped out, his shoes crunching on scattered gravel. The sound came again, clearer now, coming from a shadowy recess between two bridge supports. His heart thundered in his chest as he approached. At first, all he could make out was a bundle of dirty fabric, easily mistakable for discarded trash. But then the bundle moved, and Thalion's breath caught in his throat. A child lay curled into a tight ball, her small frame racked with violent shivers. Her clothes, if they could even be called that, were nothing more than tattered rags. Dark matted hair obscured most of her face, but when she lifted her head slightly, Thalion saw eyes that reflected a depth of suffering no child should know. Those eyes locked onto his for just a moment before rolling back as consciousness slipped away from her. Thalion didn't hesitate. He shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her frighteningly cold body. She weighed almost nothing as he lifted her, far too little for a child her size. Her skin felt like ice against his arms. "Hold on," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. "Just hold on." The drive to Mount Sinai Hospital was a blur of red lights and desperate prayers. Every few seconds, Thalion glanced at the small form lying across his back seat, checking to make sure she was still breathing. Her breaths came, in shallow gasps that seemed to grow weaker with each passing minute. The emergency room erupted into action the moment he burst through the doors with the child in his arms. Doctors and nurses swarmed around them, their voices urgent but professional as they lifted her onto a gurney. In the harsh fluorescent light, Thalion finally saw the full extent of her condition. Dark bruises peeked out from beneath the rags she wore. Her cheeks were sunken, her skin nearly translucent. "Sir, you need to tell us what happened," a nurse pressed him, her pen poised over a clipboard. "Is she your daughter? What's her name?" Thalion opened his mouth to respond, but movement from the gurney caught his attention. The girl's eyes had opened again, filled with a terror that made his chest ache. Her cracked lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear. He stepped closer, leaning in despite the nurse's protests. A single word escaped the girl's lips before unconsciousness claimed her again. "Please." That whispered plea hit Thalion like a physical blow, stirring something deep within him that he thought had died alongside his family. As the medical team wheeled her away through swinging doors, he realized with absolute certainty that his life had just changed irrevocably. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that this moment would set in motion a chain of events that would test the very limits of his courage, his resources, and his humanity. The girl on the gurney wasn't just a child in need of help. She was carrying secrets that powerful people would kill to keep buried. But for now, all Thalion could do was sink into an uncomfortable waiting room chair, his hands still trembling from the cold and shock. Among the rags they'd cut away from the girl's body, a nurse had found a single scrap of yellowed paper. She handed it to him without comment. In faded ink, it bore a single word: Arliza. Dawn crept through the hospital windows, painting sterile white walls in shades of pale. Gold. Thalion hadn't moved from his vigil outside the pediatric intensive care unit for 6 hours. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie long discarded, but he barely noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the door through which doctors and nurses periodically emerged, their faces growing increasingly concerned with each passing hour. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead pediatrician, approached him with a tablet in hand. The grave expression she wore made Thalion's stomach twist. "Mr. Morgan, we need to talk about the girl's condition." She gestured to a private consultation room nearby. Inside, Dr. Chen pulled up a series of images that made Thalion's blood run cold. X-rays revealed a roadmap of healing fractures, some old, others more recent. "The malnutrition is severe," she explained, her voice carefully controlled. "But what concerns us more is the pattern of injuries we're seeing. These weren't accidents." Thalion's hands clenched into fists. "How long?" "Based on the bone healing patterns, months, possibly years." Dr. Chen's eyes met his. "Mr. Morgan, I have to ask, how exactly did you find her?" He recounted the events on the bridge, watching as she made careful notes. When he finished, she nodded slowly. "I've already notified Child Protective Services. They'll want to speak with you, and the police will have questions too. When can I see her?" "She's sedated now. We're treating the hypothermia and beginning careful refeeding, but her condition is precarious. Her body has been in survival mode for so long." "Doctor." Chen paused, choosing her words carefully. "There's something else you should know. During our examination, we found unusual scarring on her back, some kind of symbol or mark. It's old but deliberate." A chill ran down Thalion's spine. Before he could respond, a sharp commotion erupted from the ICU. Alarms blared, and medical staff rushed past the consultation room door. Dr. Chen was on her feet instantly, running toward the sound. Thalion followed, his heart in his throat. Through the glass walls of the ICU, he could see Arliza thrashing in her bed, fighting against the nurses trying to hold her still. Her screams were primal, filled with pure terror. Medical equipment crashed to the floor as she kicked and twisted, her small body possessed by panic. Without thinking, Thalion pushed past the nurses and approached her bed. "Arliza," he called softly, using the name from the paper. "Arliza, you're safe here." Her struggles paused for just a moment. Wild eyes found his face and something flickered in their depths. Recognition, perhaps, or at least a lessening of fear. He kept talking, his voice low and steady. "No one's going to hurt you, I promise. I found you on the bridge, remember? You're in a hospital now." Gradually, her breathing slowed. The tension in her body ebbed, though her eyes never left his face. When a nurse approached with a sedative, Arliza flinched violently, her hand shooting out to grab Thalion's sleeve. "Wait," he said to the nurse. "Just give us a minute." Dr. Chen nodded, and the medical staff stepped back, though they remained close by. Thalion pulled a chair to Arliza's bedside, careful to move slowly. "My name is Thalion," he said softly. "Can you understand me?" She gave no response, but her grip on his sleeve didn't loosen. Up close, he could see faint scars around her wrists, like something had bound them repeatedly. The sight made him feel sick. A social worker arrived shortly after, introducing herself as Margaret Walsh. Her practiced smile didn't reach her eyes as she observed the scene. "Mr. Morgan, I need to speak with you privately." "I'm not leaving." "Her," Thalion said firmly, noting how Arliza's grip tightened at his words. Sir, this is a complicated situation. We have no identification for this child, no medical history, nothing, until we can determine her identity and locate her family. Family? Thalian's voice was sharp. Look at her. Look at what her family did to her. Ms. Walsh's smile grew, strained. Mr. Morgan, I understand you're emotionally invested, but there are procedures we must follow. We'll need to place her in emergency foster care once she's stable. No. The word came not from Thalian, but from Arliza. Her voice was barely a whisper, raw and unused, but the fear in it was unmistakable. No, please. The social worker stepped closer, her voice honey-sweet. Sweetheart, we're going to find you a nice place to stay. Arliza began to shake, her heart monitor beeping faster. Don't let them, she whispered to Thalian. Don't let them take me. The desperation in her voice shattered something inside him. In that moment, Thalian made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. I want to apply for emergency foster care status, he said, meeting Ms. Walsh's surprised gaze. Whatever it takes, whatever forms you need. I'm not leaving. Her alone. Mr. Morgan, that's not how this works. You can't. Just, I have resources, I have space. I can provide everything she needs. His voice grew stronger with each word. And more importantly, I'm the only person she trusts right now. As if to prove his point, Arliza's trembling subsided slightly. She was watching the exchange with those two old eyes, her fingers still wrapped in his sleeve like a lifeline. Ms. Walsh's expression hardened. We'll need to run background checks, home studies. There's a process. Then start it, now. Thalian pulled out his phone. I'll have my lawyer here within the hour. What followed was a flurry of calls, paperwork, and thinly veiled threats from both sides. But through it all, Thalian didn't move from Arliza's bedside. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, measuring, assessing, testing whether he meant what he said. As evening approached, Dr. Chen returned with more test results. Her face was troubled as she pulled Thalian aside. There's something else in her blood work, she murmured. Something I can't explain. I'd like to run more tests. Before she could finish, a commotion erupted in the hallway. A woman's voice rose above the general hospital noise, demanding and sharp. Where is she? I know she's here. You can't keep me from my daughter. Arliza's monitors began to scream again as her heart rate spiked. Her face had gone chalk white, her eyes wide with absolute terror. And in that moment, Thalian knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever was coming through that door was far more dangerous than any bureaucratic obstacle he'd faced so far. The woman who burst into the pediatric ICU was expensively dressed, but something about her appearance felt wrong to Thalian. Her designer clothes seemed too new, her makeup too perfect, like a costume rather than a way of life. Her eyes darted around the room before landing on Arliza's bed, and her face broke into a smile that never reached her eyes. "Baby," she cried, rushing forward. "My sweet girl, I've been looking everywhere for you." Arliza's reaction was immediate and violent. She scrambled backward in the hospital bed, pulling out her IV in the process. A keening sound emerged from her throat, not quite a scream, but something more primal. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. Thalian stepped between them instinctively. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back." The woman's face hardened for a split second before the concerned mother act returned. "Who are you? Why are you keeping me from my daughter? I've been searching for her for weeks." Dr. Chen intervened, her voice professionally calm but firm. "Ma'am, I need you to step out into the hallway. This patient is in a fragile condition." "Patient?" "She's my daughter. Her name is Mary, and she was kidnapped 3 weeks ago." The woman pulled out a folder, thrusting it at the social worker who had just entered the room. "I have all her paperwork right here. Birth certificate, medical records, everything." Ms. Walsh began examining the documents while hospital security arrived, positioning themselves near the door. Thalian remained by Arliza's bed, acutely, aware of how she had grabbed his arm again, her small fingers digging in with desperate strength. "These documents appear to be in order," Ms. Walsh said slowly, but her brow was furrowed. though I'll need to verify them with our office." The woman, who had introduced herself as Catherine Bennett, smiled triumphantly. "Of course they're in order. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to take my daughter home." "That's not possible," Dr. Chen interjected. "This child is severely malnourished and shows signs of extensive abuse. She needs to remain hospitalized, and there will need to be an investigation." "Investigation?" Catherine's voice rose. "Are you accusing me of something? My daughter was kidnapped. I've been sick with worry. Whatever happened to her was done by whoever took her." Throughout this exchange, Thalion noticed something odd. Every time Catherine spoke, Arliza's grip on his arm tightened rhythmically, almost like she was tapping out a pattern. He listened more carefully to Catherine's voice, and suddenly he understood. Arliza was reacting to specific words, specific phrases. This wasn't random fear, this was conditioned response. "Your paperwork says her name is Mary Bennett," he said carefully, watching Arliza's reaction. No response to that name. "But when I found her, she had a paper with the name Arliza." A definite squeeze of his arm at that name. Catherine's smile flickered. "Well, Mary Elizabeth, we sometimes call her Mary Liza. Children's nicknames, you know how they are." The explanation was smooth, practiced, too practiced. Thalion looked at the birth certificate in Ms. Walsh's hands. The paper was weathered, yellowed with age, but when he looked closer, he noticed something strange about the edges. They were too clean, too even for a document supposedly. 15 years old. "Miss Bennett," he said quietly, "would you mind telling us which hospital Mary was born in?" "St. Francis Memorial," she replied promptly. "Interesting," Thalion said, pulling out his phone, "because I happen to sit on the board of St. Francis Memorial Hospital, and they didn't have a maternity ward in 2009. It was closed for renovations that entire year." The change in Catherine's demeanor was instant and chilling. The maternal concern vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. She snatched the documents back from Ms. Walsh. "Clearly there's been some confusion. I'll return with my lawyer." She turned and strode out, leaving a wake of tension behind her. The security guards followed, presumably to ensure she left the building, but Thalion knew this wasn't over. Whatever game was being played here, it was just beginning. Once Catherine was gone, Arliza's death grip on Thalion's arm slowly relaxed, though she remained pressed against the wall. Dr. Chen approached carefully with a fresh IV line, but Arliza shrank away from her touch. "Let me," Thalion said softly. He turned to Arliza, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "This is going to help you feel better. Will you let Dr. Chen put it back in? I'll stay right here." Arliza's eyes darted between them before she gave a tiny nod. As Dr. Chen worked, Thalion noticed something he hadn't seen before. A small scar behind Arliza's ear, partially hidden by her hair. It looked almost like a number. Miss Walsh was on her phone, speaking rapidly to someone at her office. "Yes, I need an emergency investigation. No, the documents are highly suspicious. I understand, but given the circumstances..." Thalion used the moment to speak quietly to Dr. Chen. "The mark you mentioned earlier on her back, what exactly did it look like?" The doctor's expression grew troubled. "It's not something I've seen before. Almost like a brand, but with a specific pattern. I took photos for the medical record if you..." She was interrupted by a code blue announcement from another room. As she rushed out, Thalion was left with the growing certainty that he had stumbled onto something far darker than a simple case of child abuse. The way Catherine had appeared so quickly, with perfectly prepared documentation, the specific reactions Arliza had to certain phrases, the mysterious marks on her body. His thoughts were interrupted by Arliza's small voice, so quiet he almost missed it. "She'll come back," she whispered. "They always come back." The words sent a chill down his spine. "Who are they, Arliza?" But she had retreated into silence again, her eyes fixed on the hospital room door. Her body trembled slightly, but there was something else in her posture now, a tension like an animal preparing to run. Thalion recognized that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror in the months after losing his family, when the walls of his life were closing in, and every instinct screamed at him to escape. He made a decision then, one that would have far-reaching consequences he couldn't yet imagine. Pulling out his phone, he made 2 calls. The first was to his lawyer, Jerome Waters. "I need emergency custody papers drawn up immediately." "And Jerome? Use every connection you have. This needs to happen fast." The second call was to his head of security, Michael Chen. "I need you to do 2 things. First, get to Mount Sinai Hospital and set up a protection detail. Second, I need you to start digging. Look for any similar cases. Children found with mysterious marks, suspicious documentation, women claiming to be their mothers. Something tells me we're looking at a pattern here." As he ended the calls, he noticed Arliza watching him intently. There was something different in her gaze now. Not trust exactly, but perhaps the first glimmer of hope. He sat down beside her bed again, sensing she wanted to say something. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "The others. They're still there." Night had fallen over the hospital, turning the windows into dark mirrors. Thalion sat in the dimmed room watching Arliza's fitful sleep. Security guards were stationed outside, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were just buying time. Catherine's appearance had changed everything. Now they were on a countdown, though to what, he wasn't sure. His phone vibrated silently. Jerome, his lawyer, had sent preliminary paperwork for emergency temporary custody. The message below it was less encouraging. "Courts open at 9 a.m. Until then, our hands are tied." A small whimper drew his attention back to Arliza. She was trembling. In her sleep, her face contorted in fear. Without thinking, Thalion reached out to smooth her hair, but the moment his hand touched her head, her eyes flew open with a silent gasp. "It's okay," he said softly, withdrawing his hand. "Just a dream." Arliza's breathing slowly steadied, but her eyes remained alert, scanning the room as if checking all the exits. It was a habit Thalion had noticed before, one that no child should have. "Would you like some water?" he asked, reaching for the cup on the bedside table. She nodded slightly, and he helped her hold the cup with her shaking hands. As she drank, Thalion noticed her gaze drift to the photo he'd placed on the table earlier, the only personal item he carried in his wallet. It showed a laughing woman with auburn hair holding a young boy on her shoulders, their joy radiating from the image. "That's Rebecca," he said quietly, surprised by how steady his voice remained. "My wife. And that's Tommy, our son. They..." He paused, struggling with words he'd never spoken aloud before. "They're not here anymore." Arliza studied the photo intently, then looked at him with a question in her eyes. "It was a regular Sunday," he continued, the memories washing over him. "We were driving back from Tommy's soccer game. He'd scored his first goal, and we were going to celebrate with ice cream." His hands clenched involuntarily. "The other driver was texting. He ran a red light. I tried to swerve, but..." He fell silent, lost in the screech of tires, the sound of crushing metal. When he finally looked up, he found Arliza watching him, with an expression he hadn't seen before, empathy. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and touched his hand. The gesture was so unexpected, so gentle that Thalion felt tears threatening to fall. Here was this child, who had suffered unimaginable trauma, trying to comfort him. "I understand," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. When they take everything." It was the most she'd spoken since he'd found her. Thalion remained perfectly still, afraid any movement might cause her to retreat back into silence. "They said I was bad," she continued, her voice dropping even lower. "That's why no one wanted..." She trailed off, her small frame starting to shake again. "You're not bad, Arliza," Thalion said firmly. "Nothing they did was your fault." She shook her head violently. "You don't understand. The others... I left them there. I ran away, but they're still..." Her breathing became erratic, panic taking over. Hey, look at me," Thalion said gently. "You're safe now. No one's going to take you back there." "You can't promise that," she whispered. "She found me. They always find us." Before Thalion could respond, a soft knock at the door made them both jump. Dr. Chen entered, carrying a tablet and looking troubled. Mr. Morgan, could I speak with you for a moment? Her eyes flicked meaningfully toward the hallway. Thalion started to rise, but Arliza's hand shot out, grabbing his sleeve with surprising strength. It's okay, he assured her. I'll be right outside the door where you can see me. She released him reluctantly, her eyes fixed on the doorway as he stepped out with Dr. Chen. The labs came back, the doctor said in a low voice. We found something unusual in her blood work. Trace amounts of a compound I've never seen before. I sent it to our toxicology department, but they're equally puzzled. Thalion felt his stomach twist. What kind of compound? That's just it, they can't identify it. But here's what's concerning. It appears to be breaking down in her system, and as it does, her vital signs are becoming increasingly erratic. It's like her body is going through some kind of withdrawal, but from what we don't know. As if to emphasize her point, the sound of medical equipment beeping more rapidly came from Arliza's room. They rushed back in to find her clutching her chest, her face contorted in pain. It burns, she gasped, like before, when they... Her words were cut off by a violent seizure. Dr. Chen sprang into action, calling for assistance as she tried to stabilize her patient. Thalion found himself pushed to the side as medical staff swarmed the room. Through the chaos, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. On Arliza's arm, where the IV had been, a pattern was appearing on her skin, similar to the mark Dr. Chen had described on her back. But this one was new, emerging like a brand rising to the surface. Somewhere in the hospital, a door slammed. Running footsteps echoed down the hallway, and through the observation window, Thalion caught a glimpse of a face he recognized, one of the nurses who had been checking on Arliza throughout the day. But she wasn't wearing hospital scrubs anymore. Instead, she was hurrying toward the exit, speaking urgently into a phone. Thalion's security training kicked in. "Stop that nurse!" he shouted to his security team, but as they moved to intercept her, the hospital's fire alarm suddenly blared to life. In the ensuing chaos of evacuation protocols and sprinkler systems, the mysterious nurse vanished. Back in the room, Dr. Chen had managed to stabilize Arliza, but her face was grave. Whatever's happening to her, it's accelerating. We need to figure out what they gave her, and fast. Thalion looked down at Arliza's unconscious form, at the strange mark that now stood out starkly against her pale skin. They were running out of time, and he had a sickening feeling that the hospital, with all its security and medical expertise, was no longer the safest place for her to be. Dawn was breaking when Jerome Waters arrived at the hospital, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of a sleepless night. He took one look at Thalion's haggard face and pulled him into a quiet corner of the waiting room. "It's worse than we thought," Jerome said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been making calls all night. That woman, Catherine Bennett. The name doesn't exist, at least not before 3 weeks ago. Everything about her, driver's license, social security, credit history, it all appeared suddenly like someone built an identity from scratch." Thalion ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble of 2 days without shaving. What about the nurse who disappeared? Gone. Security cameras went dark during the fire alarm, too convenient to be coincidence. Jerome hesitated, then pulled out his tablet. "But that's not the worst part. Look at this." He showed Thalion a news article from 6 months ago, a similar case in Boston, a child found abandoned, showing signs of abuse and mysterious medical symptoms. A woman appeared claiming to be the mother, with perfect documentation. The child disappeared from the hospital before social services could investigate. There are others, Jerome continued, scrolling through more articles. Chicago, Philadelphia, Seattle, always the same pattern, and the children are never found. Before. Thalion could respond. Dr. Chen approached, looking exhausted. "Mr. Morgan, she's asking for you." In Arliza's room, the morning light cast long shadows across the medical equipment. She looked smaller than ever in the hospital bed, her skin almost translucent, but her eyes were clear as they fixed on Thalion's face. "They're coming," she whispered as he sat beside her. "I can feel it." "How do you know?" She touched the mark on her arm, which had developed into a distinct pattern overnight. "It's how they track us. When it shows up, she swallowed hard. That's when they come. To take us back. Back where, Arliza? You need to tell me. She shook her head, terror flickering across her face, but then she seemed to make a decision. Slowly, painfully, she turned onto her side, pulling up the back of her hospital gown. The mark Dr. Chen had mentioned was there, but now Thalion could see it clearly. An intricate design that looked almost like circuitry. They put things in us, she said, her voice shaking. Medicine, they said, to make us better, but it makes us need them. When we try to leave, she gestured weakly at the monitors showing her unstable vitals. A noise in the hallway made her flinch. Ms. Walsh from Social Services was approaching, with 2 police officers. Thalion's heart sank. He knew what this meant. Mr. Morgan, Ms. Walsh said as she entered, her voice professionally detached. We've received some concerning information about your background check, and given the suspicious circumstances, the court has ordered that Arliza be placed in state custody immediately. You can't, Thalion started, but one of the officers stepped forward. Sir, we have a court order. Please step away from the child. Arliza's monitors began beeping faster as her panic rose. Don't let them, she pleaded, grabbing Thalion's hand. They'll find me if you let them take me. Ms. Walsh's expression softened slightly. Sweetheart, you'll be safe in our care. We're taking you to a secure facility. No. Arliza's scream was raw with terror. Not another facility, please. The officers moved forward, and something in Thalion snapped. 8 months of grief and helplessness crystallized into a single moment of clarity. He couldn't save his wife. Son, but he could save her. Jerome, he said quietly, initiate Protocol 7. His lawyer's eyes widened. Protocol 7 was something they had set up after Rebecca and Tommy's death. A complete dissolution of Thalion's visible assets, transferring everything to hidden accounts. It was meant to be a last resort, a way to disappear if the pain became too much. Thalion, think about what you're doing, Jerome warned. Once I start this, there's no going back. You'll lose everything. Your company, your properties, your reputation. I lost everything 8 months ago, Thalion replied. Now I have a chance to save someone else from losing everything too. Jerome hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. He pulled out his phone and pressed a single number. What happened next was carefully orchestrated chaos. The hospital's power flickered, a technical malfunction caused by one of Thalion's loyal IT executives. In the momentary darkness and confusion, Michael Chen's security team created a diversion at the hospital's main entrance. When the backup generators came on 30 seconds later, Thalion's hospital room was empty. The monitors were silent, the IV lines neatly disconnected. On the bed lay Thalion's wallet, phone, and a note that read simply, I'm sorry, but it wasn't over. As Thalion carried Arliza through a service entrance to a waiting car, he knew they were just beginning the hardest part. She was trembling in his arms, her fever rising again, the strange mark on her arm growing more distinct. I can't go far, she whispered against his shoulder. The medicine, it's pulling me back. Then we'll find out what it is, Thalion promised. We'll find a way to break their hold on you, whatever it takes. As they drove away from the hospital, Thalion caught a glimpse of Catherine Bennett watching from an upper window. She wasn't smiling now, and she was speaking into a phone. He knew they would be hunted, that every resource would be used to find them. But for the first time since losing his family, Thalion felt truly alive. He had a purpose again, not just to save Arliza, but to expose whatever darkness had tried to claim her. The road ahead would be dangerous, but he had made his choice. In the back seat, Arliza's fever spiked again, and she whimpered in pain. Thalion held her hand tightly, silently vowing that he would find a way to free her from whatever poison they had put in her system. He had already lost one family to forces beyond his control. He wouldn't lose another. The old lake house had been Rebecca's favorite retreat, a place so private it didn't appear on any of Thalion's official property records. As he carried Arliza up the creaking wooden steps, memories washed over him. Weekend getaways, Tommy's first fishing trip, quiet mornings watching the mist rise over the water. Now the house stood as silent witness to a different kind of refuge. Almost there, he murmured to Arliza, who had been drifting in and out of consciousness during the 3-hour drive. Her skin burned against his chest, the fever rising steadily despite the medication Dr. Chen had secretly supplied before their escape. Inside, a layer of dust covered the furniture, but everything remained exactly as they'd left it 8 months ago. Thalion carried Arliza to Tommy's old room, his heart clenching at the sight of dinosaur posters and model airplanes still hanging on the walls. He laid her gently on the bed, watching as her eyes fluttered open, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Where?" she managed to whisper. "Somewhere safe," Thalion assured her, though he knew that safety was relative now. "Try to rest. I need to make a call." In the kitchen, he used the burner phone Jerome had provided to dial a number he'd memorized hours ago. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. "I told you only to use this number in an emergency," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Her fever's getting worse. The marks are spreading." Thalion glanced back toward Tommy's room. "What did the lab find?" "The preliminary results are concerning. The compound in her blood isn't just a drug. It's some kind of synthetic hormone combined with a tracking metabolite. It creates a dependency while simultaneously allowing them to trace the subject through biological markers." Thalion's grip tightened on the phone. "Can you help her?" "Maybe, but I'll need more data. The sample we took wasn't enough to synthesize an antidote, and without knowing the exact composition..." A crash from Tommy's room cut the conversation short. Thalion ran back to find Arliza on the floor, her body convulsing. Her eyes had rolled back, showing only whites, and the mark on her arm was pulsing with an angry red glow. Acting on instinct, he gathered her into his arms, trying to keep her from hurting herself. Her skin felt like it was on fire, and she was muttering something between spasms, words he couldn't quite make out. "Arliza," he called softly, "can you hear me?" Her eyes snapped open, but there was no recognition in them. "Please," she begged, addressing someone Thalion couldn't see. "I'll be good, I promise I'll be good." The words struck him like physical blows. How many times had she pleaded like this? How many times had she been ignored? "You are good," he whispered fiercely. "You've always been good." Something in his voice seemed to reach her. The tension in her body eased slightly, and her eyes focused on his face. "They're in my head," she whispered. "I can feel them." Pulling. Thalion carried her back to the bed, his mind racing. The compound in her blood wasn't just causing physical symptoms. It was triggering psychological responses, memories of trauma that went deeper than he'd imagined. He returned to the phone, where Dr. Chen was waiting anxiously. "How long does she have?" The doctor's silence was answer enough. Finally she spoke. "Without treatment. Maybe 48 hours before organ failure begins. The compound appears to be designed this way. Make them dependent, then force them to return or face the consequences. There has to be something we can do." "There might be." Dr. Chen's voice dropped even lower. "In the chaos after you left, I managed to access some of the false nurse's belongings. She left behind a vial of something. I've been analyzing it, and it appears to be a stabilizing agent. Not a cure, but something to buy us time." Hope flickered in Thalion's chest. "Where are you?" "I can't tell you that. They've been watching the hospital asking questions, but I can have someone deliver it. There's an old pharmacy in Warren Creek, about 20 miles from where I think you are. I'll have my brother leave the package there tonight." Warren Creek. Thalion knew it. A small town he and Rebecca used to drive through on their way to the lake house. "How will I know it's safe?" "The package will be marked with a butterfly. It was Rebecca's favorite, wasn't it? She told me once, during Tommy's checkups." The mention of his family would have paralyzed him months ago. Now it strengthened his resolve. "Thank you, Sarah." "Don't thank me yet." "And Thalion, be careful. The woman who claimed to be her mother. She came back to the hospital after you left." The way she looked at Arliza's medical records, it wasn't maternal concern, it was ownership. After ending the call, Thalion returned to Tommy's room. Arliza had fallen into a fitful sleep, her face flushed with fever. He placed a cool cloth on her forehead, watching as she instinctively leaned into the comfort. A memory surfaced. Tommy, sick with flu, asking for one more story before bed. Rebecca reading to him, her voice soft and soothing. The same children's books still sat on the shelf across the room. Almost without thinking, Thalion picked up one of the worn volumes. Once upon a time, he began reading quietly, there was a little bird who lived in a golden cage. As he read, Arliza's breathing steadied slightly. Her hand found his, holding on with surprising strength. Outside, the sun was setting over the lake, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, people were looking for them. But for this moment, in this room filled with ghosts and memories, they were safe. Thalion knew it couldn't last. Soon he would have to leave her to get the medicine from Warren Creek. Soon they would have to face whatever darkness had marked her. But for now, he simply held her hand and continued reading, his voice steady even as his heart ached with a familiar mix of loss and love. The little bird had forgotten how to fly, he read on, but sometimes in her dreams she remembered what freedom felt like. Warren Creek looked like a ghost town in the pre-dawn darkness. Thalion parked 3 blocks from the pharmacy, his heart pounding with every shadow that moved in the dim streetlights. He'd waited until Arliza had fallen into a deeper sleep before leaving Mrs. Peterson from the local grocery store watching over her, one of the few people who still remembered the Morgans from their summer visits. The old woman hadn't asked questions when Thalion appeared at her door at midnight. She'd taken one look at the sick child and the desperation in his eyes and simply nodded. Some kindnesses, Thalion was learning, came without interrogation. The pharmacy's windows were dark, its closed sign gathering dust. Thalion moved carefully through the alley behind it, where Dr. Chen had said her brother would leave the package. Every rustle of leaves made him freeze. Every distant car sound sent his pulse racing. The butterfly marking was exactly where she said it would be, a small drawing on a paper bag tucked behind a loose brick. Thalion reached for it, his fingers trembling slightly. "I wouldn't touch that if I were you." The voice came from the shadows. Thalion spun around to find a man watching him, middle-aged, wearing an expensive suit that seemed out of place in the rundown alley. "Who are you?" Thalion demanded, though he already suspected the answer. "Someone who understands what you're dealing with." The man stepped forward, his shoes clicking softly on the pavement. "The girl, Arliza, as she calls herself now, she's very sick, isn't she? Fever, seizures, strange marks appearing on her skin." Thalion said nothing, but his hand instinctively moved closer to the package. "That won't help her," the man continued. "Oh, it might seem to for a while, but eventually it'll make things worse. We designed it that way." "We?" The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I represent people who have invested a great deal in her development. People who want her back safely." "Safely?" Thalion's voice cracked with anger. "I found her half dead under a bridge. A regrettable situation. She wasn't supposed to escape. None of them were." The man clasped his hands behind his back. "But now you have a choice, Mr. Morgan. The compound in her system, it's not just making her sick, it's changing her. Every hour that passes, every dose of the stabilizing agent you give her will only accelerate the process." "What process?" "Let's just say Arliza is part of something bigger than either of us, something that could change everything." He pulled out a business card, holding it out. "When she starts showing signs, and she will, call this number. We can help her in ways you can't." Thalion stared at the card, but didn't take it. "Like you helped the others? The ones in Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia?" Something flickered in the man's eyes, surprise maybe, or annoyance. "You've done your homework. Then you know what happens to those who try to interfere. The girl will suffer, Mr. Morgan, and it will be your fault." "No," Thalion said quietly. "Her suffering tears on you, all of it." He snatched the package and ran. Behind him, he heard the man call out, "You can't save her, Morgan. The process has already begun." The drive back to the lake house was a blur of paranoia and fear. Every car seemed to be following him, every set of headlights a potential threat. But when he finally pulled up to the house, everything was quiet. Mrs. Peterson met him at the door, her kind face creased with worry. "She's been calling for you," the old woman said softly. "Such terrible dreams." In Tommy's room, Arliza was tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. The marks had spread up her neck now, creating patterns that seemed to shift in the dim light. Her eyes opened as Thalion approached, and the relief on her face made his chest ache. "You came back," she whispered. "Of course I did." He sat beside her, carefully preparing the injection as Dr. Chen had instructed. "I'll always come back." As he administered the medicine, Arliza's grip on his hand tightened. "I can hear them," she said, her voice trembling. "In my dreams, they're talking about the others, about what we're supposed to become." "What do you mean?" But she had drifted off again, the medicine pulling her under. Thalion watched as her breathing steadied, the fever seemingly reducing. But the man's words echoed in his mind. "The process has already begun." He studied the marks on her skin more carefully now. In the moonlight streaming through Tommy's window, they seemed to have a subtle pattern, not random like he'd first thought, but deliberate, like something was being written into her very flesh. Mrs. Peterson appeared in the doorway with a cup of coffee. "You should rest," she said gently. "You can't help her if you collapse." "I can't sleep," Thalion admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them taking her away." The old woman's face softened. "You know, I remember when you and Rebecca first bought this place. You were so full of dreams then, about family, about the future. After they died, I thought that light had gone out in you forever." She looked at Arliza's sleeping form. "But sometimes, Mr. Morgan, the things that break us are also the things that rebuild us." She left him with those words and the cooling coffee. Thalion sat in the darkness, watching Arliza sleep, wondering what was happening inside her body. The medicine seemed to be working, but for how long? And what was the cost? Just before dawn, Arliza stirred again. Her eyes opened, clearer than they'd been in hours, and fixed on his face with an intensity that startled him. "I remember now," she said softly, "what they were trying to make us into. Why they put the medicine in us." Her hand touched the marks on her neck. "We're not supposed to be children anymore. We're supposed to be something else." Morning light filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the lake house's worn floorboards. Arliza sat wrapped in one of Tommy's old blankets, her hands curled around a mug of hot chocolate that Mrs. Peterson had insisted on making. The fever had broken temporarily, but the marks on her skin seemed to have taken on a silvery sheen. "There were 12 of us," she said quietly, speaking more than she had since Thalion found her. "All girls, all alone. They said we were special, that we were chosen." Her fingers traced the pattern on her arm. "The medicine was supposed to make us different, better," they said, "but it hurt. It always hurt." Thalion sat beside her, careful to maintain the distance she seemed to need. "How did you escape?" A shadow crossed her face. "They got careless. The medicine, sometimes it made us stronger instead of weaker. One night, during a storm, the power went out. The locks failed." She swallowed hard. "I ran. The others, some tried to follow, but the medicine pulled them back. I could hear them screaming." Her hands began to shake, spilling hot chocolate onto the blanket. Thalion gently took the mug from her. "You're safe now," he said, though the words felt hollow with the knowledge of what the man in the alley had said. "No one's safe," Arliza whispered. "The medicine, it changes us inside, makes us forget who we were. Some of the girls at the end, they weren't themselves anymore." A noise from outside made them both freeze. Through the window, they saw a car driving slowly past the lake house. Nothing unusual for a summer morning, but Thalion's instincts screamed danger. Mrs. Peterson appeared in the doorway, her usually calm face tight with worry. "There's something you need to see," she said, holding out her tablet. The local news website showed a police bulletin. "Missing child alert. Authorities searching for kidnapped girl." Below it was a photo of Arliza, clearly taken from hospital. Surveillance footage, alongside a picture of Catherine Bennett looking appropriately distraught for the cameras. "They're playing their hand," Thalion muttered. He scrolled through the article, his heart sinking. The story was perfectly crafted. A desperate mother searching for her daughter. A wealthy man with a tragic past who had suffered a mental break, a community urged to be on lookout. Arliza's breathing had become rapid, panicked. "She's not my mother," she said, her voice rising. "She's one of them. She comes to check on the medicine to make sure it's working. Her words cut off in a gasp of pain. The marks on her skin had begun to pulse again, spreading visibly. Now she doubled over, a small cry escaping her lips. "The medicine," she managed to say through clenched teeth. "Please." Thalion quickly prepared another injection of Dr. Chen's stabilizing agent, but his hands hesitated over the syringe. The man's words echoed in his mind. "Every dose will only accelerate the process." "It hurts," Arliza whimpered. "Make it stop." The choice was taken from him as she began to seize again, her small body convulsing violently. He administered the medicine, watching as it slowly brought her back from the edge of agony. As her breathing steadied, something changed in her eyes. They seemed to lose focus, becoming distant, almost glassy. When she spoke again, her voice had an odd mechanical quality. "Protocol 7 Alpha initiated," she said flatly. "Subject responding to neural modifications. Transformation progress, 63%. "Arliza?" Thalion touched her shoulder gently. She blinked, and awareness flooded back into her eyes. "It happened again, didn't it?" she asked, fear evident in her voice. "I went away inside my head." Before Thalion could respond, Mrs. Peterson called from the front of the house. "More cars coming, 3 of them." Through the window, they could see black SUVs approaching slowly. Deliberately, men in dark suits were already stepping out of the first vehicle. "We need to go," Thalion said, quickly gathering their few supplies. "Mrs. Peterson, thank you for everything, but you should leave now. If anyone asks—" "I haven't seen a soul," the old woman finished. She pressed a small flip phone into his hand. "It's my emergency phone, not registered to anyone. Call if you need anything." She turned to Arliza, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Be strong, little one." They slipped out the back door as voices approached the front of the house. Thalion led them through the woods behind the property, following a path he and Tommy used to take on their nature walks. Every step seemed to pain Arliza, but she didn't complain, didn't slow down. When they reached the small dock where an old rowboat was tied, Thalion heard car doors slamming in the distance. Time was running out. "I remember now," Arliza said, suddenly as he helped her into the boat. "What they want us to become, why they need the medicine to change us." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "They're trying to make us forget how to feel. They want us to be empty inside so they can fill us with something else." The sound of men crashing through the underbrush reached them. Thalion pushed the boat away from the dock, watching as the lake house disappeared behind them into the morning mist. But even as they escaped, he couldn't shake the image of Arliza's eyes when she'd recited that strange protocol, empty, mechanical, devoid of the spirit he'd come to know. They were running out of time, and not just from their pursuers. Whatever was happening inside Arliza's body, whatever transformation the medicine was causing, it was trying to erase the very thing Thalion was fighting to protect, her humanity. The small motel room on the outskirts of town felt like it was closing in around them. Thalion sat in a worn armchair, watching Arliza's fitful sleep in the dim light of dawn. They'd been moving for 3 days since fleeing the lake house, staying in places that accepted cash and didn't ask questions. But each day he could see more of her slipping away. The marks had spread across most of her body now, creating intricate patterns. That seemed to shift and change with her moods. The stabilizing medicine was running low, only 2 doses left, and each injection seemed to bring less relief than the last. His burner phone vibrated. Dr. Chen's message was brief. "Blood work results complete. Here it's worse than we thought. Call immediately." Thalion stepped into the bathroom, turning on the shower to mask his conversation. "Tell me," he said when she answered. "The compound isn't just changing her body." Dr. Chen's voice was tight with worry. "It's rewriting her neural pathways, the patterns on her skin. They're external manifestations of internal changes, like her body is being reprogrammed." "Reprogrammed for what?" I don't know exactly, but the process appears to be accelerating. The stabilizing agent. It's not just maintaining her condition. It's actually speeding up whatever transformation they initiated. Thalion's free hand clenched into a fist. So, every time I give it to her. You're helping them complete what they started. A pause. How many doses does she have left? 2. Don't give them to her. Dr. Chen's voice was firm. I'm working on something else, a way to possibly reverse the process. But I need time. She's in pain, Thalion said quietly. When the medicine wears off. I know. But the pain might be the only thing keeping her human right now. The only thing anchoring her original consciousness against whatever they're trying to overwrite it with. A sound from the other room cut their conversation short. Thalion rushed out to find Arliza sitting up in bed, her eyes wide but unfocused. Subject stability at 47%, she said in that mechanical voice that had been appearing more frequently. Neural reconfiguration approaching critical threshold. Initiating emergency protocols. Arliza, Thalion called softly, approaching her. Come back to me. She blinked several times, awareness slowly returning to her eyes. It happened again. When he nodded, tears welled up. I'm forgetting things. Names, faces. Sometimes I can't remember what I was like before, who I was before. Thalion sat beside her on the bed. Tell me what you do remember. Anything. She was quiet for a long moment, her small hands tracing the patterns on her arms. I remember. A song. Someone used to sing it to me before they took me. A woman with red hair. Her voice broke. But I can't remember her face anymore. It's like they're erasing me, piece by piece. The pain in her voice struck something deep in Thalion's chest. He reached for the bag containing the remaining doses of medicine, but Arliza grabbed his arm. Don't, she whispered. Please, it makes the forgetting happen faster. But the pain. Pain means I'm still me. Her grip tightened as another wave of tremors hit her. Promise you won't let them make me forget. Promise you won't let them turn me into whatever they want me to be. Before Thalion could respond, a sharp knock at the door made them both freeze. Through the thin curtains, they could see shadows moving outside. Mr. Morgan? A woman's voice, Catherine Bennett. We know you're in there. Please be reasonable. You can see what's happening to her. We're the only ones who can help. Arliza began to shake, but not from the withdrawal this time. Pure terror filled her eyes. No, she breathed. Not her. She's the one who... Her words cut off as she doubled over in pain. The marks on her skin began to pulse with an inner light, and when she looked up again, her eyes had that terrible emptiness. Proximity alert, she said in the mechanical voice. Primary handler detected. Initiating retrieval sequence. To Thalion's horror, she began to move toward the door, her movements jerky and unnatural. He caught her just as her hand reached for the doorknob. Fight it, he urged, holding her as she struggled against him. Remember who you are. Remember the woman with red hair, the song she used to sing. Something flickered in her empty eyes. Her movements became less mechanical, more desperate. Help me, she gasped in her own voice. They're in my head. I can feel them. Pulling. More knocks at the door, more urgent now. You're only prolonging her suffering, Catherine called. The process can't be stopped. Let us help her complete the transformation. Thalion held Arliza closer as she fought against whatever was trying to control her. Her skin burned with fever, the marks pulsing faster now. He could feel her slipping away, being pulled into that empty state where they wanted her to remain. In desperation, he began to hum, a lullaby he used to sing to Tommy, one Rebecca had taught him. Arliza's struggle slowly ceased as the melody reached her. Tears began to fall from her eyes, cutting tracks through the silvery patterns on her cheeks. I remember, she whispered. The song. My mother used to sing something like that. Before they took me. Before. They made me forget. The door handle began to turn. They'd found a key. Thalion scooped Arliza into his arms and ran for the bathroom window. As they escaped into the grey morning light, he could hear Catherine's voice behind them, no longer, wearing any pretense of maternal concern. "She belongs to us," the woman shouted. "The process will complete itself, with or without your interference. You're only prolonging the inevitable." But Thalion ran on, holding Arliza close, feeling her fight against the programming they'd tried to install in her mind. He didn't know where they would go next, didn't know how to save her from what was happening inside her body. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not let them take away who she was. Even if it meant running forever, he would keep her human, keep her whole, keep her herself. Rain pounded against the windows of Dr. Chen's private clinic, the small building on the outskirts of the city, looking abandoned in the growing darkness. Inside, Arliza lay on an examination table, her breath coming in short. Gasps as Dr. Chen studied the readings on her equipment. "The transformation is nearly complete," she said quietly to Thalion. "Her original neural patterns are being overwritten at an exponential rate. In a few hours—" She left the sentence unfinished, but her meaning was clear. Thalion looked at Arliza's face, at the silvery patterns that now covered almost every inch of her visible skin. She hadn't spoken in her own voice for nearly 6 hours, cycling between unconsciousness and that terrible mechanical state. The last thing she'd said as herself was a broken whisper, "Don't let me disappear." The reversal. "Treatment," he said to Dr. Chen. "Is it ready?" She hesitated. "Theoretically, but Thalion, you need to understand, this isn't just about the compound in her system. They've fundamentally altered her biology. Trying to reverse it could kill her. And if we do nothing, then we lose her anyway." Dr. Chen touched one of the pulsing marks on Arliza's arm. "Whatever they were trying to create, it's almost done. Soon there won't be anything left of who she was." Thunder crashed outside, and Arliza's eyes snapped open. "System integration at 92%, she said in that hollow voice, "preparing for final protocol initialization." "How long?" Thalion asked. "The treatment will take about an hour to administer, but—" Dr. Chen glanced at the windows. "They're going to find us. They always do. You saw how they tracked you to the motel." Thalion's hand found Arliza's, squeezing gently. Her fingers were cold, unresponsive. "Then we'll need help buying time." He pulled out Mrs. Peterson's old flip phone and dialed a number he'd memorized long ago. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Michael, it's time to repay that favor." Michael Chen, his former head of security, didn't hesitate. "Whatever you need, boss." Within 30 minutes, a small army of private security personnel had surrounded the clinic. They were all former employees who owed their careers to Thalion, men and women who had stayed loyal even after his company was stripped away. "No one gets in," Michael assured him. "We'll hold them off as long as you need." Dr. Chen began preparing the treatment, her movements quick and precise. "Once we start, we can't stop," she warned. "No matter what happens, no matter what she says or does, we have to see it through." Thalion nodded, watching as she inserted the first IV line. Almost immediately, Arliza's body went rigid. "Warning," she said in the mechanical voice. "Foreign substance detected. Initiating defensive protocols." Her back arched off the table as the first wave of convulsions hit. The marks on her skin began to pulse rapidly, like a circuit board going haywire. Dr. Chen quickly inserted the second IV line. "Hold her!" she shouted, as Arliza began to thrash violently. "We can't let the lines come out." Thalion tried to hold her still, while causing as little pain as possible, but her strength was inhuman. Somewhere in the distance, car engines roared. "They're here?" Michael's voice crackled over the radio. "Multiple vehicles. They're not trying to be subtle anymore." The sound of rain was punctuated by approaching footsteps, voices, the metallic click of weapons being readied. But Thalion's world had narrowed to the small form fighting beneath his hands. "Critical system failure," Arliza's mechanical voice announced. "Attempting emergency shutdown, attempting emergency shutdown, attempting—" Her words cut off in a scream that was entirely human. Her eyes flew open, and for a moment, Thalion saw recognition in them. "It hurts," she gasped in her own voice. "Everything's breaking." "I know," he soothed, holding her hand tightly. But you have to keep fighting. Stay with me." The marks on her skin had begun to fade in some places, only to pulse more brightly in others. Her temperature was rising dangerously high. "She's fighting it," Dr. Chen said, preparing the final stage of treatment. "But her body is trying to reject the reversal. Her systems are at war with themselves." Outside, voices were shouting. The sound of struggle reached them as Catherine's people tried to breach the security perimeter. "Mr. Morgan," Catherine's voice carried over the chaos, "you're killing her. The process must be completed or she'll die." Arliza's vital signs were becoming erratic. The machines monitoring her began to wail in alarm. "She's right," Dr. Chen said grimly. "Her body can't take much more of this. We have to make a choice, complete the reversal and risk losing her, or stop now and let their process finish." Thalion looked down at Arliza's face. Even through the pain, even through the mechanical protocols trying to take over, he could see her, the real her, fighting to stay present. "What do you want?" he asked softly. "Tell me what to do." Her eyes found his, tears cutting through, the silvery patterns on her cheeks. "I want to stay me," she managed through clenched teeth. The choice made, Thalion nodded to Dr. Chen. "Finish it." She pushed the final treatment through the IV lines. Arliza's back arched again as wave after wave of convulsions racked her small frame. The marks on her skin began to pulse so brightly they were almost blinding. Outside, the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood told them the perimeter had been breached. Footsteps thundered down the clinic's hallway, but Thalion kept his eyes on Arliza's face, watching as the battle for her very identity played out in her eyes. He held her hand and whispered the words she had asked him to promise days ago. "I won't let them make you forget. I won't let them take away who you are." The door burst open behind them, but before anyone could enter, Arliza's body went completely rigid. The marks on her skin flared one final time, then began to fade like morning mist under the sun. In the sudden silence, her eyes closed and her hand went limp in his grip. The machines monitoring Arliza's vital signs had gone silent. In the doorway, Catherine and her men froze, watching as the last traces of the silvery marks faded from the child's skin. Dr. Chen moved quickly, checking pulse, pupils, breathing. "She's alive," she announced quietly, "but very weak." Thalion didn't release Arliza's hand, even as Catherine stepped forward. The woman's carefully maintained facade had cracked, revealing something cold and clinical beneath. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she demanded. "Years of research, millions in development, you've destroyed everything." "I saved her," Thalion replied, not taking his eyes off Arliza's face. "That's all that matters." "Saved her?" Catherine's laugh was bitter. "You've condemned her. The process was meant to be irreversible. Her body won't know how to function normally anymore. She'll tear him." Her words cut off as Arliza stirred. Everyone in the room held their breath as her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, there was no recognition in them, no sign of whether the treatment had worked or failed. Then she spoke, her voice, weak but entirely her own. "Thalion." The relief that flooded through him was so intense it brought tears to his eyes. "I'm here," he said softly. "You're safe." Catherine made a sharp gesture, and her men started forward. But they hadn't taken 2 steps before Michael's security team filled the doorway behind them, weapons raised. "I wouldn't," Michael said calmly. "The police are on their way, real police, not your bought and paid for friends. And they're very interested in some information we've uncovered." The color drained from Catherine's face. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Michael held up his phone. "Dr. Chen has been very thorough in documenting everything. The compound in Arliza's blood, the genetic modifications, the neural programming, everything's been sent to multiple secure locations. If anything happens to any of us, it all goes public." Catherine's composure cracked completely. "You don't understand. We were trying to help them. These children, they were all abandoned, unwanted. We were giving them purpose, making them into something greater. You were turning them into robots, Thalion cut in, his voice hard. Erasing everything that made them human, everything that made them themselves. They were nothing before us, Catherine's voice rose hysterically. Street rats, orphans, throwaways. We were giving them value. They already had value, Arliza said softly. Everyone turned to look at her. Though her voice was weak, there was strength in it and something else, pity. We were always people. You just couldn't see it. The sound of sirens grew closer. Catherine's men began to shift nervously, looking to her for direction. But she seemed frozen, staring at Arliza as if seeing her for the first time. The others, Arliza continued. I remember where they are now, all of them. And I remember their names, their real names. She met Catherine's eyes. They remember too. Deep down, under all your programming, they remember who they are. And now they'll have a chance to find themselves. Again. The sirens were very close now. Catherine seemed to deflate, the weight of her failures crushing her carefully constructed authority. When the police burst in moments later, she offered no resistance. As the chaos of arrests and statements swirled around them, Dr. Chen continued monitoring Arliza's condition. Her vital signs are stabilizing, she reported, but she's not out of danger yet. The reversal process, it's going to take time, and there may be complications we can't predict. But she'll live? Thalion asked. Yes, Dr. Chen smiled. And, more importantly, she'll live as herself. The morning sun was rising outside, painting the rain-washed world in shades of gold. Arliza's eyes were growing heavy, exhaustion from her ordeal finally catching up with her. But before she drifted off, she squeezed Thalion's hand. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing me, the real me. As she fell into a natural sleep, her first in what felt like ages, Thalion watched the steady rise and fall of her chest. The marks were gone, leaving only faint traces that would fade with time. Like scars, they would tell a story of what she had survived, but they would not define her. Michael approached quietly, holding out a folder. You'll want to see this. We found it in Catherine's files. Arliza's real identity, her original birth certificate. Her real name is... No, Thalion said firmly, not taking the folder. That's her story to learn when she's ready. For now, she is who she chooses to be. Through the window, he could see police cars and ambulances, their lights painting the wet pavement in swirling patterns of red and blue. Soon there would be questions to answer, statements to make, a long road of recovery ahead. But for now, in this quiet moment between night and dawn, Thalion simply held Arliza's hand and watched her sleep. Somewhere in the distance, birds began their morning songs. A new day was beginning, not just for Arliza, but for all the children, like her, who would now have a chance to reclaim their humanity. The thought filled Thalion with a feeling he hadn't experienced since losing his family, hope. But mixed with that hope was a hint of fear. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Arliza's recovery would be complex, filled with challenges they couldn't yet imagine. And somewhere out there were others who had been involved in the program, others who might not want their secrets exposed. Still, looking at Arliza's peaceful face, Thalion made a silent vow. Whatever came next, whatever challenges lay ahead, he would be there. He had failed to protect one family. He would not fail again. 6 months had passed since that rainy night at the clinic. Autumn painted the trees around the lake house in shades of gold and crimson, their leaves dancing on the cool breeze. Thalion stood on the porch, watching Arliza sit at the end of the dock, her feet dangling over the water. The recovery hadn't been easy. There were nights of terrible nightmares, days when the pain would return unexpectedly, moments when she would freeze mid-sentence as old programming tried to resurface. But slowly, steadily, Arliza had fought her way back to herself. Dr. Chen's treatments had worked better than anyone had dared hope. The last traces of the silvery marks had faded, leaving only the faintest shadows that caught the light sometimes. When Arliza moved, more importantly, her mind had remained her own, though changed by what she had endured. The investigation into Catherine's organization had revealed the full scope of what they'd attempted. 11 other children had been rescued, each beginning their own journey back to themselves. Some had found their original families, Others had been placed in loving homes. All of them were healing. Mrs. Peterson emerged from the house carrying a tray of hot chocolate. "She's been out there a while," the old woman said softly. She had become a regular presence in their lives, a bridge between what was lost and what could still be found. "Today's a hard day," Thalion replied. "It's the anniversary of when I lost them." Understanding crossed Mrs. Peterson's face. She set the tray down and squeezed his arm gently before heading back inside, leaving him to his thoughts. Thalion picked up the mugs and walked down to the dock. Arliza looked up as he approached, making room for him to sit beside her. At 10 years old, her real age they had finally learned, she seemed both younger and older than when he'd first found her. "I've been thinking," she said, accepting the hot chocolate, "about memory, about how some things fade and others stay sharp like glass." Thalion waited, letting her find her words. She had become more thoughtful in these months, processing her experiences in her own way and time. "I remember things now that were blocked before," she continued. "My mother's face, the sound of my father's laugh, the day they died in the fire." She paused, taking a sip of her drink. "But I also remember everything that came after. The pain, the fear, the way they tried to make us forget we were human." "Those memories are part of you too," Thalion said gently. "They don't make you any less yourself." Arliza nodded slowly. "Like your memories of Rebecca and Tommy. They hurt, but they're precious too, right?" The question caught him off guard. For a moment, he couldn't speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. "Yes," he managed finally, "very precious." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the lake in shades of amber. A flock of geese passed overhead, their calls echoing across the water. "The other children," Arliza said suddenly. "The ones like me. They're all safe now." "Yes, Michael's team made sure of it. They're all getting the help they need. And Catherine, she'll never hurt anyone again. The trial starts next month." Arliza absorbed this information quietly. Then, in a smaller voice, "What about me?" Thalion turned to look at her, really look at her. The scared, broken child he'd found under the bridge was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had fought her way back from the edge of oblivion, someone who had taught him how to live again. "The adoption papers came through this morning," he said softly. If that's still what you want." Her eyes met his, bright with unshed tears. "You still want me, even after everything?" "Arliza." He set his mug down and turned to face her fully. "When I lost my family, I thought that was the end. I thought I'd never feel whole again, but finding you, helping you, it gave me back something I thought was gone forever." "What?" "Purpose, hope, a reason to keep going." He smiled gently. "You saved me as much as I saved you." She launched herself into his arms, hot chocolate spilling forgotten onto the dock. They held each other as the sun began to set. Two broken people who had somehow found a way to be whole again. "Can we go up to the house?" Arliza asked finally. "Mrs. Peterson said she was making apple pie, and I think I'm ready to look at the photo albums, the ones with Rebecca and Tommy." Thalion felt tears prick his eyes. She had never asked about them before, had seemed afraid to intrude on those memories, but now she was ready to be part of the whole story, the joy and the pain, the loss and the finding. As they walked back to the house, hand in hand, the last light of day turned the windows to gold. Inside, Mrs. Peterson was humming as she moved around the kitchen. The smell of baking apples and cinnamon filled the air, mixing with the crisp autumn breeze. It wasn't the life Thalion had imagined for himself. The pain of losing Rebecca and Tommy would always be there, a quiet ache in his heart. But beside it now was something new, the joy of watching Arliza heal, grow, and become more fully herself with each passing day. They had both lost everything once, but together, they had found something neither of them expected, a second chance at family, at hope, at life itself. As they stepped into the warm light of the house, Arliza squeezed his hand. "We're home," she said simply. And they were.